Leandria Johnson is a fake preacher. She is an alliance with the devil, and she misguides people. Leandria has sold her soul.
You blind! If you sit in your church and you know, well, why can't I live like that? You can't tell me you sit in church and you don't be like, well, why can't I live like my pastor? Why can't I live like my first lady?
I'm pretty sure they don't want me to be there because I said Christianity, the church. I said that.
No more sugarcoating, no more quiet. Pastor Gino Jennings has finally broken his silence, and this time it's focused squarely at gospel singer Leandria Johnson. From profanity-laced rants to rebuke in the contemporary church, she's been branded daring, rebellious, even dangerous. But now, one of the most vociferous voices in holiness is calling her out, loudly and shamelessly. And what he said? It astonished everyone in the gospel community. The church world has always had its share of strong voices, but when two of the loudest and most contentious people in contemporary day Christianity clash, it's likely to create headlines. On one side, you have Pastor Gino Jennings, a fiery, no-nonsense preacher renowned for his raw, confrontational sermons and his uncompromising position on holiness. On the other, Leandria Johnson, the Grammy-winning gospel powerhouse with a testimony that's as raw as her singing. She's renowned for cussing in public, drinking freely, and undermining the same institutions that once supported her.
So yeah, I'm cussing. Okay. And you drink too. Yeah, you do. Okay, third, you done dealt with some hurt too in the church. Oh, okay,
But here's the twist. Until recently, these two paths never intersected publicly. Jennings has preached against what he considers the contemporary gospel business, while Leandria has condemned churches that ignore those battling with real-life challenges. But when Gino Jennings recently gave a sermon that seemed strangely precise, one that was intended at a drunken gospel singer exploiting her suffering to excuse obscenity, the internet lighted up with one inquiry. Was he referring about Leandria Johnson? In this video, we're going to break down precisely what Pastor Jennings said, why fans feel it was a direct aim at Leandria, and what it tells about the widening gulf between the holiness movement and the mainstream gospel world. We'll dive into the sermon that ignited the fire, the history behind Leandria's contentious reputation, and if this moment symbolizes a wider change in church culture. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. If you haven't heard of Pastor Gino Jennings, let me introduce you to one of the most divisive individuals in contemporary day Christianity. Known for his forceful, no-holds-barred style to preaching, Jennings has earned a reputation as a passionate advocate of classic holiness teaching. And he's not hesitant to tread on toes to make his point. Jennings is the founder and head of the First Church of Our Lord Jesus Christ in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he's been making waves in the religious world for years. But it's not simply his lessons that get people talking. It's his uncompromising delivery and his readiness to speak out what he perceives as the corruption in the church. Whether it's blasting prosperity preachers for exploiting the poor, or rejecting some sections of the mainstream gospel music business, Jennings has never been one to shy away from controversy. His sermons are full of fire, frequently pushing both his congregation and the larger Christian community to live up to the highest ideals of holiness. But this aggressive approach hasn't come without its detractors. Many perceive Jennings as harsh, self-righteous, and excessively severe. His rejection of things like current Christian music, worldly entertainment, and even some types of church leadership has made him a polarizing figure. Some people regard him as a modern-day prophet, daring to speak truth to power, while others consider him as a guy on a mission to alienate the very people he's meant to be protecting. The controversy? A holiness preacher, opposing the contemporary gospel business. What makes Jennings even more contentious is his opinion on the current gospel business. He's regularly called out gospel singers, musicians, and preachers, who he says are more interested in fame and money than sharing the pure word of God. His criticism isn't merely focused at secular musicians or ministries outside of his network. He's been known to go after high-profile personalities in the gospel field. For instance, he's publicly chastised the likes of Bishop T.D. Jakes, Joel Osteen, and even well-known gospel musicians for their engagement in what he terms worldly activities. Jennings feels that the gospel business at large has lost its emphasis on righteousness and purity, and he has no issue openly stating his views. This position has garnered him both acclaim from conservative forces and anger from others, who regard his approach as excessively harsh. Now, here's the kicker. Despite his caustic words, Jennings has managed to retain a dedicated following. His congregation, albeit not as vast as that of some of his more prominent contemporaries, is fervently dedicated to his ideas. For his admirers, he symbolizes a purity of religion in a period when it seems like the church is yielding to the demands of celebrity and popularity. But for his opponents, he's a preacher who lives on discord and controversy, a preacher of conviction, or simply a provocateur. At 62, Pastor Gino Jennings has created a history of resistance, but as we'll see later in this film, his statements regarding Leandria Johnson have prompted even more doubts about the nature of his beliefs. Is he truly battling for the preservation of holiness, or is he merely utilizing shock value to remain relevant? And more significantly, might this lecture have been an intended hit at Leandria Johnson? We'll go into the details of the incident that triggered this whole argument, but it's crucial to understand the guy behind the message. Pastor Gino Jennings doesn't do things lightly, and when he speaks, people listen. For better or for bad, Leandria Johnson is no stranger to the limelight. In fact, she's made quite an impression in the realm of evangelical music. A winner of Season 3 of Betty's Sunday Best, Johnson immediately became one of the most famous voices in gospel music. Her strong voice, deep passion, and unique combination of gospel with current sound made her a standout singer, and she looked prepared to take the gospel world by storm. However, Leandria's climb to stardom didn't come without its share of difficulties. Beneath this sparkling brilliance, there has been a terrible personal life, and an ongoing fight with the same problems that other gospel singers strive to avoid: substance addiction, alcoholism, and public scandals. The troubles of fame Leandria's troubles became public knowledge following her unexpected absence from the gospel scene for a spell. She didn't shy away from facing her demons. She admits to battle drinking, suffering with her personal relationships, and confronting the stress of living up to the high expectations put upon her as a gospel musician. Her honesty about her troubles was both commended and condemned, with some viewing her as bold and real, while others believed her actions didn't correspond with the purity that the gospel message is supposed to communicate. In one of the most contentious times of her career, she shared a video on social media in which she was clearly drunk, a moment that led to massive outrage from both fans and other gospel musicians. The video was taken off soon thereafter, but the harm was done. The event acted as a sharp reminder that even the most accomplished and renowned musicians aren't immune to personal strife. Despite her hardships, Leandria Johnson returned to the gospel scene, trying to reclaim her footing. She published numerous albums, including The Experience and Bigger Than Me, both of which won recognition for their emotional depth and spiritual clarity. But although her singing skills continued to enchant listeners, her personal life remained a subject of debate. Rumors concerning her personal relationships, her occasional public outbursts, and her resignation from various gospel groups continued, casting a cloud over her career. The breaking point? Leandria's public clashes. One of the most dramatic and polarizing times in Leandria's career occurred when she openly fought with numerous high-profile personalities in the gospel music business, and appeared like she couldn't keep out of the spotlight, constantly immersing herself in conflicts with other gospel performers, pastors, and producers. Her disagreement with several gospel music business elites was ignited after she made statements condemning the gospel industry's commercialization, specifically its concentration on money and celebrity, rather than religion and purity. Leandria was vocal about how the business was abusing artists, and she went as far as to claim that many gospel celebrities were more interested with creating their brand than promoting the actual gospel. This made her a divisive figure. To others, she was a truth-teller, fearlessly calling out an industry that had become more about profit than purpose. But to others, her words looked angry and out of place, particularly for someone who had risen to stardom via the same profession. This dispute didn't end at words. Leandria was considered as a challenge to the gospel establishment, with many of her contemporaries distancing themselves from her. Behind the scenes, there were rumblings that some individuals in the business believed she had destroyed bridges that could never be mended. But here's where it gets fascinating. Despite these difficulties, Leandria Johnson nevertheless managed to retain a dedicated following base. She continued producing songs, maintaining loyal to her particular style and vocal power, but her reputation was a combination of praise for her talent and cynicism about her personal decisions. The gospel community was split. Some still considered her as a great performer with a special calling, while others saw her as a liability to the purity of gospel music. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Pastor Gino Jennings decides to speak up. But what led to his stunning remarks? Why did he feel the need to jump into this mess? And how did his remarks set the scene for a possible conflict that no one anticipated coming? Was it simply another example of his typical provocative preaching? Or was there more to this call-out of Leandria Johnson than met the eye? For years, Pastor Gino Jennings has been renowned for his shamelessly forthright and sometimes contentious opinions on a broad variety of subjects, notably within the church and gospel music business. From his no-nonsense approach to church teaching to his frank rebukes of popular Christian culture, Jennings has made it obvious that he is not afraid to stand aside from the mainstream. So when he called out Leandria Johnson during a sermon, it wasn't just another one of his contentious statements, it was a full-on challenge to the gospel music community and its top singers. The triggering event, a provocative sermon, Pastor Jennings' statements on Leandria, occurred during one of his high-profile church services, when he was giving a heated sermon about the plight of the gospel music business. While speaking on the perils of celebrity culture within the church, Jennings explicitly alluded to Leandria Johnson as an example of someone who had exploited her platform and fallen victim to the lures of fame, addiction, and scandal. He said that Leandria had wandered far from the straight road and was not a faithful representation of the gospel's message. To some, his statements came out as harsh and uncalled for, but to others, it sounded like a crucial wake-up call. Jennings did not mince words. He harshly blasted Johnson's history of public drunkenness, personal turmoil, and her contentious social media outbursts, arguing that her lifestyle was an insult to the sanctity that gospel music and ministry were intended to symbolize. But what truly raised eyebrows was the timing of his words. Pastor Jennings' sermon was being live-streamed and millions of people across the globe were watching, many of them coming in to hear his opinion on the condition of gospel music. The question on everyone's mind was, why did he choose to single out Leandria Johnson? The unexpected discovery, a call to responsibility. What made Jennings call out especially stinging was his indictment of the gospel music business as a whole. He wasn't only attacking Leandria, he was also making a clear statement about the whole system that enables and even promotes such conduct. Pastor Jennings said that Leandria's ascent to prominence was a result of the very commercialization of the church, an industry where talent is sometimes emphasized above moral purity and where immorality may be disregarded for the purpose of selling records and filling pews. He contended that the church had allowed the desire of fame and money to overwhelm the actual goal of ministry, and that Leandria's troubles were only a symptom of a greater spiritual corruption inside the gospel music business. He bluntly asserted that no one should be permitted to represent the gospel message if they weren't living according to God's plan, and that the church needed to take a harder position against the conduct that had become much too typical among Christian celebrities. This touched home for many viewers, spurring arguments across social media. But there was one significant issue on everyone's mind. Would Leandria respond? And how would the public take a confrontation between a renowned gospel musician and one of the most controversial pastors in the country? The startling twist? Leandria's muted reaction? Or was it? As predicted, Pastor Jennings' words swiftly gathered notice, and soon the chatter around them reached Leandria Johnson herself. The social internet exploded with conjecture over her reaction. Some expected she would go to her platforms to defend herself, while others questioned whether she would keep mute and let the issue die down. After all, the last thing she needed was another public quarrel that might further undermine her already fragile image. For a time, Leandria did keep quiet. She didn't make a reaction on social media or address the subject in interviews, but then something occurred that no one predicted. One evening during a live performance at a concert, Leandria delivered a cryptic phrase that sent shockwaves across the gospel music world. In the midst of her presentation, she halted, looked straight at the crowd and remarked, "Sometimes you have to let your actions speak louder than words, and sometimes the truth comes out when you least expect it." This short statement, albeit subtle, sounded like a direct shot at Pastor Jennings. But it wasn't simply about reacting to the criticism. It was her way of expressing her dignity and not allowing the comments of others define her. She wasn't going to be pulled into a public debate. Instead, she would let her profession and music speak for itself. But here's where the twist occurs. Leandria's statement, albeit ambiguous, appeared to unleash a fresh firestorm of debate. Fans started to believe that she was planning to face Jennings in her own manner. Could there be a greater, more dramatic clash ahead? But it wasn't the most startling aspect. As the dust cleared from the first argument between Pastor Gino Jennings and Leandria Johnson, it became evident that this wasn't simply another celebrity fight. This has the potential to damage the fundamental foundations of both their ministry and the gospel music industry at large. While many people were initially hooked to the drama, waiting for the next furious social media post or sermon, the effects of this public clash stretched well beyond mere words. In reality, the repercussions would expose deeper faults inside both the church culture and the gospel music business. Leandria Johnson, the pressure to react, and the weight of public opinion. For Leandria Johnson, this dispute wasn't only about preserving her personal image, it was about defending her position in the evangelical music business. Johnson has always been a controversial character, not only because of her music, but because of her personal choices, including her problems with drug addiction and her very public divorce. She's had ups and downs, and her admirers know her as a lady who is vulnerable and ready to express her hardships honestly. However, the critique from Pastor Gino Jennings was a new degree of scrutiny. Jennings was not simply challenging her behavior or choices. He was accusing her of being a dishonest spokesperson of the faith. This got at the core of who she was, not only as a gospel singer, but as a child of God. In interviews after the conflict, numerous industry insiders said that Leandria had been under immense pressure from her team, record label, and fans to answer to Jennings. They thought that if she didn't, it would tarnish her public image even more. Others felt that her quiet was a purposeful decision, one that would compel listeners to pay attention to her songs and activities rather than merely her personal life. But as weeks passed, the weight of the situation grew even more clear. Leandria started to draw back from her public engagements and concentrate on her own spiritual path. She stopped commenting on social media about the conflict and instead began expressing more personal comments about her relationship with God. This adjustment signaled that she was selecting a more inward strategy to manage the crisis, one that would appeal with her core supporters. Still, many questioned, might this stillness suggest that Leandria was planning for a more dramatic reaction later? Pastor Gino Jennings. The influence on his ministry and followers. On the opposite side of the dispute, Pastor Gino Jennings was facing his own set of repercussions. As a pastor recognized for his hard-hitting remarks and no-compromise position, Jennings has built his ministry on controversy and raw love. He's never shied away from taking out important personalities in the Christian sector, whether they be pastors, gospel singers, or political officials. However, the impact from his public criticism of Leandria Johnson was more difficult than he presumably imagined. While his ardent fans backed his position, many others questioned the appropriateness of expressing complaints in such a public way. Some opponents believed that Pastor Jennings' statements were divisive and unproductive, adding to the corrosive climate of celebrity culture in the church. Despite these attacks, Jennings remained unshaken. In fact, he doubled down on his words, stating that the church was becoming too indulgent and accepting of sin, and that responsibility was required for anybody who considered themselves a spokesman of the gospel. He continued to gain support from his flock, with many regarding him as a prophet who spoke the painful truth that others were too frightened to express. Still, the feud's influence on Jennings' ministry couldn't be overlooked. Church leaders throughout the larger community started to doubt the efficacy of his combative attitude. Would he alienate more prospective followers if he continued to participate in these public disputes? Would the debate drive away those who desired a more sensitive approach to ministry? Jennings, for his part, didn't appear to care about public opinion. He had always thought that staying fast in the truth was more essential than being liked or admired. But as his ministry began to develop, he would confront even greater issues about his future and the long-term repercussions of this rivalry. The influence on the gospel music business. The rippling impact of the conflict. This public fight didn't simply impact Leandria Johnson and Pastor Gino Jennings, but also sent shockwaves across the whole gospel music business. Gospel music, which has always been connected with the church, was suddenly at the heart of a dispute concerning the connection between celebrity culture and religion. The conflict highlighted issues about the commercialization of the gospel message and whether church leaders and gospel performers were genuinely keeping the ideals they espoused. For Leandria Johnson, the event emphasized the double standards that many gospel performers confront. On the one hand, they are recognized for their musical prowess, but on the other, they are held to an almost unattainable moral standard. At 42, Leandria Johnson has held her quiet for years, but now she's breaking her silence in a manner no one anticipated coming. The gospel singer, recognized for her great voice and real candor, is finally replying to the daring and controversial remark by Keon Henderson. He implored her, "Please quit preaching." This horrifying public brawl has caught the gospel community by storm. But what's actually underlying this tension? Is there more than meets the eye? Stay tuned as we go deep into the actual reason why Leandria Johnson has had enough of being silenced, and why Keon Henderson's remarks may have finally pushed her over the brink. Leandria Johnson, a force in the evangelical music field, is no stranger to controversy. Known for her strong voice and outspoken devotion to her religion, she's made waves for both her magnificent music and her times of vulnerability. But this time, it's not about her music. It's about a public battle, a showdown that's shaking up the gospel community. Keon Henderson, a preacher with a rising following, has found himself at the heart of this conflict. He made a strong public declaration, "Please quit preaching," addressed at none other than Leandria Johnson. But what prompted this? Is this simply another celebrity feud, or is there something more occurring here? Why would someone like Keon Henderson, renowned for his polished public demeanor, take such a radical step? In this video, we will dig out the specifics underlying their conflict. We'll explore the motives behind Keon Henderson's request and Leandria's passionate response. We'll investigate the fundamental mechanics of their relationship, the public drama, and what's at risk for each of them. You'll hear the facts, the context, and the implications of this intense public discussion, so stay around, because this tale has a lot more layers than it would appear on the surface. By the conclusion of this film, you'll have a clear grasp of why Leandria Johnson's response matters, and what it implies for her career, her faith, and her role in the gospel community. To comprehend the drama between Leandria Johnson and Keon Henderson, we first need to grasp who these two people are in the gospel world. Leandria Johnson and Keon Henderson, we first need to comprehend who these two personalities are in the gospel world. Leandria Johnson came to prominence after winning the 3rd season of Sunday Best, a famous gospel music competition on BET. Her unusual voice and genuine emotional performances made her a household celebrity. But although her musical career rose, her personal life wasn't always as smooth. Johnson has been honest about her challenges, including fights with alcohol, relationships, and mental health concerns. Yet her sensitivity, paired with her evident brilliance, made her a revered figure among fans and critics alike. She became recognized for her raw honesty and her inability to sugarcoat her experience. This honesty, however, also made her a lightning rod for criticism. On the other side, Kion Henderson is renowned as a charismatic preacher with a fast-growing flock and an increasing public presence. As the founder of the Lighthouse Church in Houston, Texas, Henderson has built a reputation for himself with his bold preaching style and a message that mixes practical life advice with faith. He's also recognized for his firm acumen, which has enabled him to spread his influence beyond the pulpit. But despite his accomplishments, his ascent to popularity has not been without controversy. Some detractors accuse him of leaning too strongly into celebrity culture, with his polished social media presence and numerous appearances on mainstream channels. It's evident that both Leandria Johnson and Kion Henderson are powerful in their own way, each occupying their own place in the gospel music and ministry field. However, their worlds were clearly on a collision path, until Kion Henderson made an incendiary revelation that would fuel the present conflict. Please quit preaching. What could possibly motivate a renowned preacher like Kion Henderson to publicly call out a gospel artist and fellow believer like Leandria Johnson? Well, that's precisely what we'll get into next. As the scene was set for these two strong leaders in the gospel world to collide, it all began with a single, eyebrow-raising statement from Kion Henderson. For those who may have missed it, Henderson, in a sermon or interview, made a bold remark encouraging Leandria Johnson to please stop preaching. But why? What may have provoked this public reaction from the pastor? Let's break it down. Kion Henderson's ascent to prominence wasn't simply based on his preaching style or his success as a pastor, but also because of his polished, high-profile lifestyle. He portrayed himself as a man of accomplishment, someone who linked religion with riches in a manner that looked seamless. This picture has gained him a lot of adoration, but also a fair amount of criticism. Many followers look up to Henderson as an example of what a contemporary pastor should be: successful, poised, and apparently faultless. But when it comes to his dealings with others in the gospel sector, there has been a growing feeling that he's possibly becoming a little too loud and critical, particularly when it comes to the way others choose to express themselves in their ministries. Now, enter Leandria Johnson. As noted before, she is renowned for her outspoken personality, and her sincerity is one of the reasons why her admirers adore her. She's addressed her problems with drugs, mental health, and the nuances of her religion journey. This uncensored attitude, although liberating to many, also puts her in a vulnerable position. Leandria has been attacked for the way she expresses herself, particularly when it comes to difficult themes, and for some, her attitude may appear risky. When Henderson's statement was made, it seemed like a direct assault on Johnson's fundamental soul, her sincerity. It's one thing to condemn someone's preaching style, but to urge someone to quit preaching entirely is not only disrespectful of their ministry, but also weakens their voice and calling in the Christian community. So why would Henderson, who himself is a preacher and a famous personality in the faith-based society, make such a scathing judgment about another person of faith? The explanation may lie in a deeper issue: a collision of ideals between two distinct methods of carrying out one's religion. It's conceivable that Kion Henderson was merely expressing anger about Leandria Johnson's unorthodox approach to ministry and the gospel. Johnson's willingness to openly discuss her own issues and share them with her audience may have looked out of place, or unsuitable in Henderson's view, who is more recognized for his polished, elegant approach to both ministry and life. He's developed a business on portraying a feeling of accomplishment and control, which is at odds with Johnson's more sensitive, raw, and flawed public character. What makes this entire issue even more problematic is the fact that as a pastor, Henderson is meant to be a leader who helps guide people toward redemption and recovery. In many respects, Johnson's honesty about her battles with alcohol, personal shortcomings, and previous misdeeds actually matches better with the teachings of grace, atonement, and the value of authenticity in religion. By instructing her to stop preaching, Henderson may have been undermining not just her ministry, but also a much-needed discourse about openness and vulnerability in the church. At this time, Leandria had a choice to make: respond or keep quiet, and that's precisely what occurred next. The stress was tremendous. The gospel community was waiting. Leandria Johnson, renowned for her outspoken and unapologetic demeanor, wasn't going to let Keon Henderson's public censure slip. After all, she was a lady who had fought her own challenges, personal, public, and spiritual, and emerged stronger, with a narrative to share. So when Henderson's words made the rounds, it was only a matter of time until Johnson had something to say. But this wasn't simply about reacting to an insult. For LaAndrea, it was about standing up for herself, her ministry, and the honesty she had fought so hard to retain. She wasn't going to allow someone to define the terms of her religion and how she communicated it, particularly when they didn't understand her journey or the necessity of her honesty. In an interview immediately after the event, LaAndrea wasted no time addressing the elephant in the room. Her answer was furious, passionate, and sincere, a genuine testimonial to the sort of lady she is. With determination, she stated, "I won't keep quiet. I can't keep quiet." This wasn't merely a defense of her preaching technique. This was a defense of her very identity. Leandria said that her ministry wasn't about preaching perfection. It was about sharing her story, her hardships, and her achievements in a manner that may benefit others. She wasn't attempting to be faultless, and she didn't want anybody to believe that they had to be perfect to serve God. Her rawness had connected with numerous people, and she wasn't going to let it be muffled by the demands of someone who had a different ministry perspective. In her answer, she also touched on the fundamental concerns that were at the core of this public fight. Leandria highlighted that the gospel isn't about coming up with a perfect picture, but about showing up in your truth. She wasn't preaching for the purpose of fame, following, or money, something that many in the profession were frequently accused of. Her approach to ministry was about establishing a safe environment for those who had gone through challenges, much like her, to connect with God and recover. Leandria didn't simply stop at defending herself. She used the event into an opportunity to highlight a bigger problem within the religion community: the stifling of individualism. For far too long, the church, in many situations, has demanded its leaders and people to adhere to a precise mold of holiness, one that was frequently polished, faultless, and untouchable. Johnson's message was obvious. God doesn't simply operate through individuals who fit that model. He works through the broken, the untidy, the ones who have the bravery to show up despite their shortcomings. Her statement generated a whirlwind of controversy online. Supporters flocked around her, applauding her for being honest and for fighting back against the demands of conformity. Critics, on the other hand, accused her of disrespecting Keon Henderson's authority and eroding the sanctity of the pulpit. The lines were formed and the public spectacle was just heating up. But what's most revealing is what Leandria Johnson's answer represented: a change in the narrative of what it means to be a modern-day preacher. No longer was the image of the flawless, polished pastor the only one that was acceptable.